Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Jenna. We will get started in a few minutes. We'll wait till folks sign on. Good morning, everyone. If you're just joining us, we will get started in a minute or so. Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us. We might still have a few folks trickling on the webinar, but we can go ahead and get started. Thank you again for making the time to come to the Keeping Community in the Community Reinvestment Act webinar. This is presented to you today jointly by Housing Action Illinois and Woodstock Institute, and we want to give a big thanks to Housing Action Illinois for putting together the infrastructure to make this happen. And we want to take the time and take a moment to thank all of you for joining us today, especially in light of the public health crisis that we are facing due to COVID-19 and the resultant social distancing and working from home that many of us are experiencing. We'll note that there's so many things right now that are uncertain and things that will continue to remain uncertain in the coming days and months. But one thing that we do know is true. We are going to continue to stand up for and advocate for the communities that are most vulnerable in the communities that we represent. One way we can stand up for our communities is to make sure they're being served in the ways that they need. And that's why today we're very excited to present to you about the Community Reinvestment Act and make the case for why you should submit a comment to protect it. So thank you again for joining if you just hopped on, and we will get started with our presentation. So to introduce who will be talking to you today, I am Jenna Severson, the first picture listed. We're in order of those who are speaking. And as I mentioned, this is a webinar put on by Woodstock Institute and Housing Action in partnership. And I have my colleague Brent Adams on the phone and online, and Sharon Lagenza representing Housing Action. We also are glad to have John McDermott, who some of you may know from other organizations, but now he is a consultant for Woodstock Institute. And one thing I will note is that you can ask any of us questions during this webinar and afterward. I will have our contact information listed, but there should be a question box in your panel, on the GoToWebinar panel, and it should be open. So at any point in the webinar, if you do have a question, please write it down, post it, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. We have time built in for that. You can always follow up with us after. This webinar will be posted online on Woodstock Institute's website and I believe on Housing Actions, and you will get a link sent to you with the webinar presentation. But we will also make it available to all participants. So of these 4 people, these are your resources. Do not be afraid to use us in any way we can to help you with anything related to the Community Reinvestment Act. So let's launch into it. What are we talking about? What's happening? Why does it matter? So The Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, is an anti-redlining law. It's got its roots in Chicago, and right now it's under threat. In 2018, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, under the new Trump administration, issued its desire to loosen bank regulations. This is not something that we think that should be done. We know that banks are often able to get away with a lot that is not good for our communities. Now, two of the three federal banking regulators, the FDIC and the OCC, issued a proposal in the beginning of January 9th to be exact, that would dramatically change the way banks are evaluated under the Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act has not been updated in a very long time. It does need modernized and strengthened, but the plan at hand is not the way forward. If you get anything from today's webinar, that's what we want you to get. So before we get started, we have a question for you all. We want to make sure that our presentation is responsive to your needs. So if you could be so kind as to participate and characterize your knowledge of CRA, so you should be able to select one of those options, your options being that you're an expert and you could be in my place giving this webinar right now, that CRA is an important part of your work. Maybe you work with it daily, maybe you have programs that are funded by CRA, maybe you have a basic understanding of what it is but don't know so much about the details, and maybe you have no idea what we're even talking about, and it just sounds like alphabet soup. So we'll give you a few moments. Please pick one of the options, and of course there are no right or wrong answers. We just want to make sure our presentation is responsive to your needs. So we'll give a few more seconds for folks to make a choice. And we're getting our results. Okay, so most of you, 68% of you, have a basic understanding, although there is a lot of you who are saying that CRA is an important part of your work. And then on the top and bottom, we got just a few who would call themselves experts and who might not have any idea what we're talking about right now. So with that, understanding of most of us have a little bit of knowledge, we'll launch into the history. So redlining is kind of what brought us here. So after the Depression, we know that our American neighborhoods have been segregated for quite a long time, but specifically after the Great Depression, the federal government issued lending guidelines that, one, promoted suburbanization, but also, two, prevented racial and ethnic change. I included a couple excerpts from the Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual. In the 1930s, they issued goals and guidelines that specifically and explicitly said that certain areas should get money and certain should not. So you can see on the map, it's indicated red and yellow and green. Green areas were good, red areas were bad. And the appraisal guidelines were based on if neighborhoods were changing or not. And the effect of these guidelines was that mortgage lenders were not lending to racially changing neighborhoods, but most specifically what it meant to, they were not lending to Black and brown neighborhoods. So African American families who were trying to either move into an area that had what was predominantly white and or areas that were seen as high risk, which were often mapped over areas that were communities of color, were not getting the loans that they needed. This practice is a product of systemic racism, and due to the coloring of the map, as you can see on the slide, was deemed redlining. So it further segregated neighborhoods. And from the late 60s to the early 80s, Chicago was one of the leaders in the fight to change public policy that eliminated racial discrimination in mortgage lending. So we will continue to talk about that. So some products of this activism were a few important pieces of federal legislation, one being the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And HMDA, which we call it, requires banks to disclose racial composition of who they're lending to by census tracts. And so this data became incredibly important because it gave evidence to what a lot of individuals knew was happening in their neighborhoods. They knew there was racism. They knew that there were racial disparities in mortgage lending. And HMDA enabled groups, well, honestly, like Woodstock Institute, when we did the first computerized lending file, to see where neighborhoods were getting loans and where they were not, or where certain geographies were, and who was lending there and who was not. So the next piece of important public policy was the Community Reinvestment Act, what we're here talking about today. And this created a continuing and affirmative responsibility for all banks to make investments, loans, and provide services to low and moderate income communities. It is race blind, but it specifically addresses some of the negative impacts of redlining vis-a-vis the fact that areas that were disinvested in now have an affirmative obligation for banks to invest in. And CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, gave the tools so that community members could start to challenge banks if they felt that they needed to be doing more to serve communities. So we saw the first major CRA challenge in Chicago in 1984. And this is a little press clipping from that time. And that was organized by our predecessors at Woodstock Institute when First Chicago bought American National Bank. Some of the other activists that you might recognize from this time included Gil Pancata, and there were many groups, some of which still exist today, that were part of this activism. And the CRA agreement that they developed between First Chicago and American National Bank became a template for all future community benefits agreements. We won't go so far into what community benefits agreements are today, but essentially they establish certain needs that the community has and that a bank must participate in. So if a community says they need certain types of loans in certain areas, maybe they need bank branches, things like that. And now these CBAs across the nation number in the thousands, and they're lending trillions of dollars into communities that might not have been served without the tool of the CRA. So today, I am already giving you a lot of acronyms. It's alphabet soup here. But a few things that we wanted to point out when we're talking about low or moderate income areas, LMI, we mean people for whom they are 80% of the area median income in their area. So they might make less than 80% of what the median income of their area is. It's specific to your census tract. So your LMI if you're LMI in one area, maybe perhaps your LMI in San Francisco, you might not be LMI in a small rural town in Georgia, for example. Community development includes affordable housing for LMI individuals, community services for LMI individuals, economic development, so these are job creation type of activities. So these are really the stuff that makes community go when we're talking about community development. And CDFIs, community development financial institutions, make loans and invest in projects that communities need. And they use this, they funnel money from banks, and it's almost exclusively because of CRA that they can have this money to invest in projects that banks might consider too risky, or for whatever reason, they're just not making those loans. So if you're in Illinois, you might recognize Axiom Chicago, the Chicago Community Loan Fund, IFS, and there are, I believe there's 14 CDFIs in the Chicago area specifically. So there's lots of alphabet soup, and please feel free, again, ask us questions if there's any terms today that we go through that you might not understand. So now, again, I encourage you to ask questions if there's anything that I said that is confusing, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Brent Adams.
Thanks, Jenna. At the outset, let me just say that thank you for being here, and I hope everyone and their loved ones are safe and well. We'll get into how CRA works now. I'm having some trouble. There we go. Who enforces the CRA? 3 federal banking regulators implement the CRA. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or OCC, regulates national banks. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, regulates non-Federal Reserve member state banks. And the Federal Reserve Board, or Fed, as it's commonly called, regulates member banks and bank holding companies. The differences between these three regulators will be important later when I begin discussing the CRA modernization proposal. Under the current system, the federal regulators routinely examine banks with respect to their CRA performance. The CRA examiner will assign a grade to a bank based on an overall assessment of the bank's loans, investments, and services to LMI communities, and the bank's responsiveness to local community needs. Local community needs are a core component of CRA examinations currently, and there are 4 possible grades: outstanding, satisfactory, needs to improve, and substantial noncompliance. Satisfactory or higher is considered passing, and needs to improve and lower is considered failing. CRA evaluations also come into play when a bank wants to merge or acquire another bank. Jenna made some reference to this. Only banks that have passed their most recent CRA exam are eligible to merge or acquire another bank. And Jenna also made reference to challenges in the case of mergers or acquisitions. The CRA gives communities the rights to challenge mergers or acquisitions based upon the bank's CRA performance. Here is an example of a framework for a CRA exam for a large bank. I'm not going to go through each and every detail of this because it is quite detailed. It is offered today as an illustration of the various factors, both quantitative and qualitative, that come into play when a bank is examined under the CRA. So, for example, on the quantitative side, you have dollars and numbers of loans. But on the qualitative side, you have flexible and innovative lending practices, for example, under the lending test. Among the various activities that count now are bank branches, mortgages, small business lending, grants and investments, and affordable bank products. Again, qualitative factors as well as things that you can count. And it is important that a primary factor, or the primary factor for all of these activities, is that they must be for the primary benefit of low and moderate income people or communities. Jenna also mentioned this, but it bears repeating, that when you add up CRA's impact relative to all the loans, mortgages, and community development, it totals trillions of dollars that have flowed into LMI communities across the U.S. since 1977. And again, that is simply to illustrate and underscore what is at stake with respect to this modernization proposal. So let's get into the proposal. The OCC and the FDIC, 2 of the 3 banking regulators, have proposed a drastic overhaul of the CRA. The Fed did not sign on to the proposal. Without the Fed on board, a bank could find itself subject to 2 vastly different CRA frameworks. One framework applicable to the bank, and the current framework applicable to the bank's holding company. In the view of most people, consistency and uniformity are primary goals of any regulatory system. And this is why we believe the FDIC and the OCC should suspend the proposal until such time as they can get the Fed on board. The New York Times does not often opine on the issues that we work on, but they did opine on this one. They characterized the proposal as a partial demolition. And regardless of one's position on the proposal, it is undisputed that it essentially does away with the current framework and replaces it with an entirely new one. I like to call the marquee feature of the proposal the CRA-1 ratio. And the 1 ratio, as it suggests, is a ratio whereby a bank is measured based upon the total dollar value of qualified CRA activities divided by the total dollar value of deposits. Whether the activities are responsive to a community need is entirely irrelevant under this approach. Remember that under the current approach, local community need is a determining factor in evaluating CRA performance. Indeed, requiring banks to be responsive to local community needs is why the CRA was passed in the first place. Question. You'll note that the CRA1 ratio is dollar-based. If you're adding up only dollars, and I kind of gave away the answer already, do you need communities? You don't. To further put this into context, here is an excerpt from a 2019 CRA exam where you will see that community contact, that is contact by the regulator with the community, is an explicit part of the exam. You'll see, for example, in the last sentence, the exam notes the needs for financial literacy, low-cost checking accounts, secured credit cards, tools to build a credit history, and increased bank branches within smaller communities. I emphasize the bank branches part because bank branches comes up a bit later in the presentation. The proposal retains the names of the grades, that is outstanding, satisfactory, and so on, but now assigns a numerical score to each of them, which is indicated on the slide. One way to look at this overall, as if it hasn't been perhaps overemphasized already, is that this is a quantity over quality system. A small number of big deals is more cost effective to a bank than a large number of small deals. The list. The list is extremely important. Under the proposed framework, the list becomes extremely important. All caps, underline, exclamation point. Put simply, if an activity is on the list, it qualifies for credit. If it's not on the list, a bank would have to apply to its regulator to get it approved to receive credit. We, like the banks, like the clarity that a list provides, but we are not in favor of all the activities that appear on the proposed list. But one item here that you see with the last check mark that we favor is investments in CDFIs. Under the proposal, investments in CDFIs would receive double credit. And we think this is a good incentive because CDFIs are effective at steering dollars to areas of local community need. But talking about an item on the list that we're not so crazy about is improvements to athletic stadiums. Again, the one ratio, since it counts dollars only and does not measure need, it will encourage banks to do fewer high-dollar projects as opposed to many smaller dollar projects. It will also drive investments away from smaller communities and to larger communities where there is a bigger population and therefore more opportunity for bigger deals. A JUMBOTRON, for example, is a high dollar, high visibility, and simple investment, as opposed to, for example, partnering with a small nonprofit on an affordable housing project. But affordable housing, in our experience and perhaps yours, is usually, if not always, of greater community need than a JUMBOTRON. Other activities that appear on the list are infrastructure, bridges in wealthy areas, and mass transit. Under the new framework, the proposal, an activity need not be for the primary benefit of LMI communities. It can be for only the partial benefit and still receive credit. In addition to the one ratio, a bank must also pass two tests that are essentially pass-fail. The first is the lending test, and the second is a community development minimum. The lending test compares the bank's number of loans to its peers and to the demographics of the assessment area. As an example, for the demographic comparison, if an area has a high percentage of LMI income people or LMI people, the bank would be expected to have a higher percentage of loans to LMI people than, say, in an area with a low percentage of LMI people. And on the community development minimum, the total score must be at least 2% community development, activities that would count as community development. And the classic example of community development is affordable housing, as distinct from retail activities like lending. Now remember, these are pass-fail. And in college, I took a class called Continental Drift and Seafloor Spreading. I took it because it satisfied a science requirement, but that topic bears no relationship to my interests at the time, to my major, or to what would turn out to be my profession. Not only was studying for this class not a priority, it was a waste of time, considering that I had other classes that I received a grade on. Correspondingly with the proposal, the CRA would give the bank no incentive to make more loans than are necessary to pass the test, to simply get a passing rating. It would be a waste of time to make more loans than were necessary to pass the exam, from a CRA perspective, of course. Now, another component of the pass-fail system is that a bank can fail in almost half of its assessment areas and still receive an outstanding grade. Big A+. You remember I mentioned branches. Well, what happens to branches under the proposal? Branches are practically meaningless. The proposal converts them into another formula, a fraction of a fraction. Specifically, the regulator would divide the bank's LMI branches by the bank's total branches and would take that number and multiply it by 0.01. The sum of that formula would be added to the bank's score. So, for example, a bank that has 30% LMI branches, which is a lot, would have only 0.3 added to its score. What about online banks? One positive of the proposal from our perspective is that it establishes a method for assessing the CRA performance of online banks. So for banks that take more than 50% of their deposits from outside their assessment areas, they would be assessed on the basis of deposit-based assessment areas, in addition to their physical-based assessment areas. The deposit-based assessment areas would be areas in which the banks have 5% or more of their deposits. Now, one concern that many folks, including us, have is we don't know exactly how this will play out and whether it will in fact direct more CRA activities to areas in need or simply saturate certain areas with even more CRA activities. But at least it's a step in the right direction in finally including internet banking in the CRA framework. Finally, data. Now, all of these formulas that I've talked about require a lot of additional data, but the proposal by and large does not require the banks to report the data. Therefore, groups like Woodstock and your groups can't know what's going on with respect to bank CRA performance and can't keep the banks, or the regulators for that matter, accountable to their CRA obligations. And with that, I'm going to turn to my friend, Sharon Lagenza.
I think Sharon might be muted.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So that was an excellent presentation. No, I wanted to thank Brent, and I wanted to take a few minutes now that we've covered the proposed changes to CRA and wanted to put this kind of effort to dismantle CRA into a larger context in which other civil rights protections are currently being attacked. So one primary way in which we're concerned that civil rights are being dismantled is what's happening with the Fair Housing Act. For 50 years, the Fair Housing Act has allowed individuals and community groups to challenge systemic discrimination in housing segregationist housing policies, and lack of investment in historically underserved communities. We believe that this proposal to change CRA, coupled with two recent proposed Fair Housing Act rule changes, will make it virtually impossible to continue to do this. So just as a brief primer, the Federal Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting, buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other fair housing related acts. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing because of race, color, national origin, and gender, among other classes. So while CRA is focused on income levels of individuals and communities, the Fair Housing Act focuses, among other things, on race and national origin. Jenna, can you move forward one, please? So Fair Housing Act cases can be based on evidence of intentional discrimination or through a disparate impact theory. The disparate impact rule defines standards for a fair housing challenge against an otherwise neutral housing policy or practice that has an adverse discriminatory effect on a protected class. And what that means is, because it's very difficult and hopefully rightfully so to find intentional evidence of discrimination, disparate impact allows us still to challenge practices or policies that still harm communities of color or individuals. So examples would be cases like where public housing is located, and a very famous one in Chicago is Gautreaux versus CHA, or fair lending cases, which are things that we rely a lot on data, like HMDA data and other data that's reported by banks and other institutions, and insurance pricing. So last summer, I'm still on the disparate impact rule changes. That last summer, HUD proposed changes that significantly raised the burden on a plaintiff to essentially prove the case at the beginning, while increasing the defenses to defeat a case. If adopted, the new disparate impact rule would create almost insurmountable barriers to individuals in protected classes when it comes to systemic cases in the Fair Housing Act. So although the comment period closed last October, HUD has not yet issued a final rule. Okay, now please move forward. So in addition to prohibiting discrimination, the Fair Housing Act affirmatively requires that recipients of federal funds take meaningful actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, and foster inclusive communities that are free from discrimination. So recipients of federal funds include local and state governments and public housing authorities. HUD can withhold funds if a recipient is found to be in violation of this duty. In July of 2015, the Obama administration adopted robust, affirmatively furthering fair housing rules that provided guidelines and tools to help recipients comply with this requirement. In early January of 2020, though, HUD proposed changes that would essentially take the fair housing aspects out of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Instead, the proposed rule, if adopted, would allow recipients to focus almost exclusively on housing production, regardless of affordability and location. So if adopted, the proposed new rule would allow recipients of federal funds to do business without considering the segregationist or discriminatory impact of their decisions. There would be no legal incentive or penalty to encourage otherwise. So the comment period for the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule change just closed earlier this week on March 16th. Can we move forward one? So these fair housing rule changes and the proposed CRA rule change together would seriously weaken our ability to incentivize investment in historically underinvested communities. This would also seriously limit our ability to challenge the policies and systems that created and continue to reinforce the housing segregation that we experience today. So in other words, we have a potential return of redlining. With the comment periods for these Fair Housing Act rule changes now closed, and thank you to everyone who provided a comment, it's now critically important that we submit comments on CRA so that we can improve, not weaken, this critical community investment tool. So, and with that, I'll pass it on to John, who will discuss exactly how you can do that.
Thank you, Sharon. This is John McDermott. We're going to ask all of you to take some action steps, and all of these steps can be done from home, online. No printing, no mailing required. Next slide, please, Jenna. So, as Sharon just mentioned, the comment period on CRA is still open, but for less than 3 weeks now. It closes on April 8th. And you may hear some talk about a request for an extension. Senator Sherrod Brown has called for an extension, but we have to assume that that deadline is going to remain April 8th. And part of that is that we already got this extended from March 9th. Part of it is that the controller of the currency, Joseph Otting, is very skillfully managing this process in the way that he sees fit. And so one of our challenges here is that we need as many unique comments as possible. The good news in this regulatory process is that the regulators, the bank regulators, are required to summarize and respond to all the comments. The bad news is that they use an algorithm and a word search program, and they discount comments that are largely the same. So that's why uniqueness matters. And Brent mentioned early on that the Federal Reserve has not joined with the OCC and the FDIC on these changes. It is also possible that the FDIC might have a different take on this after receiving the comments than the OCC. And so our strategy is to make sure that the FDIC also sees all of our comments. So we created a sample comment letter, as you see on screen, that's addressed to both agencies. And that way you can use the exact same letter and send it to both agencies. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about two different ways that we can submit comments. And this first way is a little clunky, but it is also strategic. And this is for organizations to use their letterhead, and also certain individuals, for example, an elected official in your area, to use their letterhead. And what you do is you begin on regulations.gov at the portal, and you see the link there. And this is how you submit it to the OCC. The link takes you to the full docket for this proposal, this vast change in proposed regulations. And so you can see prior comments that have been made from across the country. You can actually look through the proposed changes, and then you'll see a blue Comment Now button. And that will take you to a window where you can, if you like, type in your comment, but you can also attach your comment. And we're recommending attaching letters on letterhead for organizations. And before you hit submit, note that there is a box that you need to check to make your comment public, and we encourage that. And then you've finished that letter, you've attached it, you've sent it to the OCC. Now email the exact same letter to the FDIC at the email address that you see there. And there is a reference number that we have there that you need to include in the subject line. And before you hit send on that email, send a blind copy, send a BCC of that email to Jenna at the Woodstock Institute so that we can track and read your comments. And by the way, all of these links are available on our website at the address that you see at the bottom of this page. Next slide, please. There is a much simpler way to submit a comment, and Housing Action Illinois has designed this, and we're really grateful for that. If you want to generate quick comments by many individuals, you can use this online tool. And so, for example, if your organization can engage your board members, staff, clients, alumni, successful home buyers, whatever that population that you work with and makes up your organization, you can email this out and maybe include a sample paragraph specific to your work, your organization, whether it's rural development or homebuyer counseling or small business development, and they can add that paragraph into their comment. Also, maybe add a sentence or two about their own circumstances, their own role in the organization, and then hit submit. Next slide, please. And once you sent your comment, we ask that you please get others to send comments. And I mentioned earlier our case for putting your comment on letterhead. Once you've sent your comment on letterhead, think of that as a tool that you can use. You can post that on your website. You can send that to local elected officials. You can send it to the local newspaper, and you can use that as a tool to get other folks sending comments. In addition to elected officials, think broadly in your community. Economic development groups, civil rights groups, chambers of commerce, ethnic associations, rural development groups, farm development organizations. So spread the word as far and wide as you can. We'd be happy to assist you in hosting a virtual letter writing event where folks could actually be writing letters, and myself or another person from Woodstock could be on the line and assisting. Please share this webinar. You'll see where we're hosting it there. We have materials on our website, and we have a CRA toolbox that includes the sample letter as a Word document. And that's how we encourage you to send it out that way so that people can easily copy and paste it onto letterhead, edit it, revise it, share it with others. Secondly, Woodstock Institute is doing a sign-on letter for organizations. It's very easy to sign on to that. Email Brent at the address you see to add your organization. And thirdly, share your stories. If your organization has a success story about something that you accomplished through CRA, or if you have a critique, if you want to see CRA strengthened in ways that are not contemplated in this proposal, share those stories. We'd love to hear them. We would like to share some of them with the media, and Jenna can help you with that and also posting them on social media. Jenna, we're turning over to you.
All right, thank you, John. Again, we have the question portal open, but we do have one more question that we want to ask to all of you. So if we could have that pop up now. And just as a reminder, so we have a question portal open. It'll be on the side. And please, 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 anything you have to ask. But while you're doing that, perhaps maybe you can take the time to tell us if you are planning to speak out about the CRA. So you can check more than one of these. Our options are you're an early bird and you plan to submit a comment before March 31st. John noted that it's important for us to see a response. We don't know the certainty of whether or not the two federal banking regulators will extend the deadline. It seems unlikely. So we want to make sure that we're getting in comments quickly, and the sooner that you can get them in, the more effective they will be. You can choose that your organization will submit a comment. You're going to do a personal one too, or that you can spread the word to your network, and this can be through a variety of ways: social media, telling people verbally, word of mouth, emailing, et cetera, et cetera. So please make your choices, and if we can get the results. Wait one more minute for the poll results, and they should be popping up now. All right. Oh, good. So we have a lot of organizations that are submitting to comment and some folks that are spreading the word. We'd love to see more personal comments. It doesn't have to be long. It can be very short, but, paragraph is even fine. I've seen a couple sentence ones. And early birds, we love an early bird. So thank you everyone for that. And I'll just say now, if you have anything that you need help with, if you have any ideas, we are all ears, and we are here to help you. So our contact information is listed, and I know I already received a question about this, and now I'll open it up to questions, but we did already receive a question if this presentation will be available. This presentation will be available. There are resources on both of our websites. And we are going to make ourselves available in any way to you if you have any ideas, questions, or insights on what you would like to do to protect CRA. So now we are going to open it up to the question part of the presentation. And I want to say thank you again, especially given this time, for everybody who participated today. Please type in your questions in the portal box and we will address them. I know it was a lot of information today, so. Okay, so I have a question from Russell and Williams who asked if we can get a copy of this presentation. And yes, you can get a copy of the presentation. Both Woodstock Institute and Housing Action intend to post the webinar to their website. I have a PDF version of the slides that I can put up directly following the presentation. And once the recording is available, I believe both of our organizations are going to post that on our website. It's my understanding that you'll also get a link with the presentation in it if you were in attendance today. So please share that. Use it as a resource. Tell others. As was mentioned in the presentation, this comment writing is a good work from home activity. Many of us are going to be working from home. So we encourage you to share that in any materials that are available to folks now. Another question, and I'm gonna pose this one to Brent. I have something that says, what are bankers saying about these changes? So Brent and or Sharon, whomever, could you ask? Or could you answer?
I'm happy to chime in with my impression of the answer to that question. We have heard from individuals who work for banks who have been willing to speak in their own off-the-record capacity about their feelings. And there was one comment that Jenna found from Byline Bank that generally, and Jenna can tell you, opposed the changes. But I can say that generally speaking, the comments we've heard have been lots of concerns. The drastic nature of the change itself is a concern because it would require huge amounts of internal changes to get up to speed, to comply with the new system. And then there's the risk that in the case of a new administration, it might have to change right back again. So I mentioned that one of the goals of a regulatory system is consistency and uniformity. And throwing this kind of drastic proposal in right now at this particularly tricky time in terms of our politics and whether we're in election year and all of that is difficult. And the additional data that I mentioned that banks would have to collect, that's also an additional big cost. So those are the types of concerns that I have heard.
Thank you, Brent. We also have a question, and it revolves around why all three banking regulators did not sign on, and about the bank holding companies being not subject to CRA. So again, I will pose this to Brent to clarify and to make sense of that. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, the Fed, thanks Jason Keller from the Fed. The Fed evaluates how well state member banks have met their CRA obligations. And you may recall that on the slide about the online banks, that there has been a concern about how exactly this new deposit-based assessment area will impact CRA, like which communities are going to be included. So that's a question as to how the data will play out. And there are lots of questions about that in terms of what's going to happen with all of these different changes and how it's going to impact the communities that are meant to be served by the CRA. So while I am not going to speak for the Fed, I can tell you that there are a lot of questions about what's going to happen with changes so dramatic as these. I know from our perspective, Woodstock's perspective, we were proposing modernization approaches that were perhaps more incremental. So, for example, developing methods to include internet banks, and proceeding along an incremental step, perhaps also including lending-based assessment areas, and so on and so forth. And we believe there should be more emphasis on branches, not less. So the big lots of question marks on this are what I believe are around some of the hesitation with all of the bankers, all the banking regulators getting on the same page.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I also have a question that says, we have someone who said that they're going to be willing to do all of the options that we listed by April 8th as they're working from home, and we'll need to figure out how to do this. So thank you. Thank you to, I think it's Guillermina, and we again emphasize that you can reach out to us, and I'll leave it to John to see if he has any comments that he would like to add about how we can be available to you.
Yes, thanks, Jenna. As I said, we would be happy to schedule events with you. And when I say events, I'm thinking online, video conferencing, conference calls. If some of you are executive directors and you want to assign a staff person to draft your letter, we'd be happy to work with that staff person. Whatever combination you can think of. If you are, let's say, in Peoria and you would like to host an online event where you could invite other organizations in Peoria to participate and then bring us in for technical assistance, that would be wonderful. So that would really help us reach across different parts of the state.
Thank you, John. I also have a question it's also from Guillermina Leon, asking if we can get the presentation forwarded to our emails. I will open it up to our friends at Housing Action to confirm that this is true, but it's my understanding that you will get a recording sent to your email. I also will note that in the handout section on the sidebar in the control panel of this presentation now is the webinar itself. So the PDF version is there, and it's my understanding that yes, you will be able to get it. And another question.
Yeah, we can send out a link to the recording to the people who are registered for the webinar.
Thank you, Sharon. How can our organization partner with you? I will again give this to John.
There's so many different ways, and we really want to do what works best for you and for your organization. So you'll see at the end of the presentation my email address and all the other presenters. Please get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to schedule a phone call if that's the easiest way to start. But we would be happy to talk with you and strategize about the best way to assist you in your city, county, town, your part of the state in outreach. So just get in touch and we will be happy to come up with a strategy with you.
Thank you, John. And we also heard from Jason Keller at the Fed. Thanks for participating, Jason, who sent around a link to the Federal Reserve's current statement, or their position rather, to the question of why all three federal banking regulators have not joined on. So I am linking here. It should be sent to all in your chat, the link that he provided us. It is also available in Woodstock Institute's resources. So if you go to www.woodstockinst.org/CRA, the link that comes up frequently, or in that Google Drive, the bit link, the bit.ly/CRA toolbox, although that's case sensitive. We do link to that resource as well. So please do your own research to see why the Federal Reserve has its own position, and we thank Jason for drawing attention to that. So another question, if we already have submitted comments, can we do it more than once? Brent?
Yes, you can. It's an open forum. If you should think of it that way, you can comment more than once. I would recommend not simply saying the exact same thing in a separate comment, but certainly, and we have commented on different aspects of all of this so far. So, for example, early on, we commented and said we thought there should be an extension of the comment period to give folks more opportunity to digest these dramatic changes. So yes, you can comment more than once.
Next question. Thank you, Brent. And do please comment more than once on behalf of your organization and individually. The next question, to confirm, we will not be able to see what score each bank has. So I will pass this to Sharon. There's a little ambiguity around the question, but Sharon and maybe tag teaming with Brent might be able to answer this.
Yeah, so my understanding is that if the rule is adopted and implemented, and there'll be some time, as Brent mentioned during the webinar, that there'll be an implementation phase, which could be a couple of years, that what we'll see are pass-fail scores, and that what we're used to seeing now in terms of the 4 different levels, that'll go away once the proposed rule is fully implemented.
And just to add, it's the score, the top line score, would be public, but the information on which the score is based, that's the information that the bank would collect, but would not be required to report.
Thank you both. Oops. Oh, I am not on mute. Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm just looking. There are ways that you can look up a bank's current score. We'll also know that. So you can go to ssiec.gov/CRA rating. So currently you are able to do that. So I will try and make that public, or if one of my friends from Housing Action can make that link public. I'm trying to see if there are any questions that we have not yet addressed. Last one. Oh, how many comments have you been copied on thus far? Do we know? I'll open this up to John and maybe Sharon. Different members of our organizations keep track of these numbers.
Yeah, I have not taken a look to see how many comments have been submitted to our portal recently, but that is something that we are tracking. Let me just say this, that I'm sure it's not as high as we would like it to be, to encourage everyone to continue to submit comments.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. Sorry, go ahead, John.
In terms of letters on letterhead, we're probably only at 25 or 30 at this point. So we have a lot of work in front of us We've spoken with many organizations, and the challenge, of course, is that people say, yes, we'll do it, but the tendency, our human tendency is to wait until the deadline. So we're really encouraging people to think of this as a day-by-day, week-by-week quest, because the sooner that we all get comments in, the more likely we will be to be able to explain it to others and encourage others. And so think of it as a that you all are the leadership cadre, that we need to get our comments in and then turn around and multiply that.
Thank you, John. One more comment that I will add, and we are at the hour, so we want to wrap up. If you are in any of the districts, if you're in any of the districts that are represented by members of the House Financial Services Committee, you might want to make sure that you forward your comment on to them. So if you're in Sean Casten's district, Chuy Garcia's district, and we'll note he's been a leader on this issue in the House, or Bill Foster's district, we specifically want to encourage you to comment both individually and from your organization, but also to forward those along to the members of Congress if you have personal relationships with them. And of course, continue to use us as resources. I think I can speak for all of us when I say thank you for making the time to come out to this presentation today. And we hope that we can encourage you to speak up for your community, say that financial institutions need to be serving local community needs. And the best way to do this is the tool that we have on the books already, and that's through the CRA. So we hope we can save, protect, and strengthen the CRA through this comment period, not deteriorate it, especially as a moment when we are approaching financial uncertainty. So if anyone else has any final remarks, I think we're going to get ready to sign off. All right, hearing nothing, thank you all so much for joining. Again, please reach out to us if you have any questions. We will make sure this presentation is available to you. And we thank you again for your time.